with an eye on the context of climate change. Reducing coal consumption is certainly an important aspiration of any policymaker interested in confronting climate change, but it's not easy. And I invited our main speaker, Dr. Howard Gruensbeck, to talk about the three major countries in the world, China, India, and the United States, describe what is going on with coal demand and consumption. And then we have a commentator, our own Nikos Staphos, who is going to maybe make some comments, but also add some remarks about several other Asian countries and what they are doing in terms of coal consumption. Dr. Gruensbeck is probably known this to many of you. He currently is senior energy economist at the MIT Energy Initiative. That's about the last year and a half or so. But before that was for 14 years deputy administrator of the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, from where he directed all their operations of energy data and analysis programs. And I think that's essentially held the organization together.
It's still together though, left. So that tells you, maybe if you were an empiricist, that would tell you that your statement is not true.
Before that, he held some key positions in the Department of Energy's policy office. He's also a resident scholar of Resources for the Future. Was a faculty member at the Business School of Carnegie Mellon University, and had some other staff jobs in the government, U.S. International Trade Commission, and the White House domestic policy staff way back in 78, 79. Dr. Gruensbeck has a PhD from Yale University in economics, and we welcome you.
Okay. We've established that I can't hold a job, and we've established that I'm old. So now let's talk about coal. So I like to think.
No one would say after 14 years that you can't hold a job.
All right. Well, anyway, thanks, Will. Appreciate the invitation. I spoke here like years ago, same room. But I'd like to share some thoughts on the future use of coal, and I look forward to hearing from my friend and part-time colleague, because I'm a non-resident in CSIS, and in addition to being here, Nick is there. So it's a very incestuous relationship, and he follows markets closely. So earlier this year, the Brookings Program on Energy and Climate published my paper on the future of coal in the United States. That's something I know a lot about. As part of that effort, I considered export market for U.S. thermal and metallurgical coal. And that led me to look at some of the other big coal-consuming countries. And I would also note that the Brookings Program also recently issued a paper on coal in India. I think it just came out last month. Co-authored by Rahul Tonga, a fellow at Brookings India, and Samantha Gross, a fellow at Brookings up the street, I guess, that they just call it Brookings. And that's a good source of information as well. So coal, I think, remains an important global energy source, although its share in the total energy use in all three countries in the world probably has already peaked. In the United States, coal's been on a downward trajectory in absolute terms for the past decade, driven mainly by its displacement in electricity generation by a combination of natural gas and renewables. And that has led to big benefits in terms of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. About 3/4 of the reduction that's occurred in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions since 2005 is attributable, in some sense, to coal's declining role in the power sector. Sometimes people talk about, what's low-hanging fruit. I guess in this case, displacement of coal was arguably free fruit. It was already on the ground. So not only do you not have to stretch, it had already fallen into your basket, as the market alone provided much of the impetus for the coal displacement. So there are some challenges. In our discussion this evening, I hope to point out some similarity as well as some differences across the U.S., China, and India in a variety of factors that have determined recent trends in their coal use and will also contribute to the future outlook. Of course, although some people refer to everything on the EIA website as data, I draw a distinction between things that are actually data that you can kind of, jelly beans that you can count in the jar, and things that you're talking about the future, which are forecasts, which are more uncertain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both. So I want to examine similarities and differences. Some of the similarities involve some of the market factors, advances in renewable generation technologies clearly having an impact everywhere, definitely exerting a role, pressure on coal's role as a fuel for electricity generation throughout the world. Some of the differences might involve perceived or actual energy security concerns, differences related to local air quality, nature of government involvement in coal production and transportation that may affect outcomes. So again, at Will's request, I guess I should, good idea to show some. So outlooks are a part of this thing, but there are also some, I think, facts that we can get to before we get to the outlooks. That's sort of the approach that I have in mind. That's a lot of numbers. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's 50 plus years of coal demand in India, China, and the world, courtesy of BP. Now that I'm no longer at EIA, I can use whatever I want. So again, one thing to keep in mind is that data conversions actually matter a lot with respect to energy, particularly for fuel like coal, where the energy value per ton depends significantly on its grade and strength, and the percentage of non-combustible contaminants that are mixed in with the fuel. So if you measure things by ton, you've got half a ton of dirt, mixed in with your coal, the dirt's probably not going to burn. For many purposes, but not for all, it makes sense to look at coal data on an energy content basis rather than a raw tonnage basis. If you're running a train moving coal, you probably don't care that much about the energy content, you care about the raw tonnage. But for these purposes, I think the energy content is the way to go. And that's what I'm going to use, although because I want to deal with a variety of different sources, the energy units, standard units, sometimes tons of oil equivalent, sometimes tons of coal equivalent, sometimes BTU, if I go back to EIA, will vary from presentation to presentation. So China, India, United States together accounted for more than 70% of world coal use in 2017, with China alone accounting for 50%. China surpassed the United States as the biggest user back in 1986. And by 2017, it was consuming 6 times what the United States was consuming. In 2015, India surpassed the United States as number 2. That's why, even though we're very chauvinistic, we're in the United States, but the United States is third on my list here, because it's only the 3rd biggest coal consumer. You can also look at coal use in the leading countries and the world as a percentage of total energy use. And, coal's share of overall energy use in the 3 countries provides sort of a different perspective. So even when the US was the world's leading coal consumer, it was only between 18 and 24% of total US energy over the 1965 to 2015 period. And recently it slid a lot below that. It's below 15% now. And even in periods where coal consumption in China and India was far lower than in the US, its share of total energy was significantly higher than coal's share in the US. So since 1970, coal's provided between 55 and 60% of India's total energy. Coal's share of total energy in China was as high as 80% back in 1970, and it's been dropping. It declined to 70% by 2010, even as China's overall coal use rose rapidly. So again, when you're looking at the share in the economy, in the energy economy versus the absolute amount, you get very different things. The decline in coal's share of energy use in China has accelerated since 2010. Coal's use is down under just about 60% in 2017, probably a little bit lower today. However, it's still, even at 60% down from 70% in 2010, it's still 4 times the share of overall US coal use. And so, again, just some perspective. So, we got online, but not on yours. So I use this more in the US context. Of course, I'm fairly old, so I remember Monty Python. I'll draw some blanks here. But there's this wonderful scene of Michael Palin and the parrot, whether it's resting or whether it's dead. And, you know, the question is, you know, when you look at the future outlook, you know, they might ask whether coal use is dying, really resting, or just feeling a bit weak, as it's described. It's not dead, it's just resting. In fact, you know, I think there's a variety of answers to that. So, the wrong way, because I'm going the way I want to go. So some of the key factors that drive coal use trends and projections. So you have the market stuff. I tried to, you know, put in parentheses, I think, where the thing is more important. You know, growth in the economies and electricity, cost of technologies, cost of fuels, particularly important in the US because natural gas is much cheaper relative to other fuels in the US than in other places. The technologies have been everywhere. Energy security concerns. Well, it depends how you define energy security, but that's something we can talk about. Local pollution and interest in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. You know, sometimes the thought is all those things go together. They can go together. Certainly, greenhouse gas reduction, less use of coal, is generally good for local pollution. But if local pollution is your target, it's not clear that greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies are the only way or the best way to go. And there may be conflicts among some of these objectives. You know, the extent of government involvement actually in the coal sector, coal production and coal transport, and policies at all government levels. So there's a lot of different drivers sort of at play here. And, you know, electricity is the dominant use of coal in all the countries. But that's true to a much greater extent in the US than in China and India. So in the US, we get in the habit of talking about, you know, as goes coal use and electricity, goes total coal use. And it makes perfect sense. You know, it accounts for electricity and heat, and there's really not much of a direct, you know, district heat industry in the United States, so it's really almost electricity. It's just the way the IEA breaks it up. Accounts for 92.5% of coal consumption in the United States. So it is the whole ball of wax. You know, that is less true in China and India. You know, it's still more than half in China. It's nearly 2/3 in India, but there are a lot more uses of coal, coal transformation, and a lot more uses in final consumption in industry and other places. So you can't take the shortcut, I think, necessarily of focusing on only what goes on in the electricity sector, although the electricity sector is really important. So that is something I would recommend. You know, there's only limited time, so I may not have too much to say about it. I may say a little bit about steelmaking later on. Just a thought. But after having said electricity isn't everything, electricity is something. So I do want to say that you will notice that if you focus on the growth rates, particularly the, you know, both over the entire period for which BP has data, the last decade, which in BP's terms is 2006 to 16, you notice that US electricity demand was kind of stagnant over this past decade. And, you know, China and India, things were growing at a pretty good clip. In fact, pretty close to how it's been growing really since 1985. So one thing to note is that the declining coal share has a much bigger implication for absolute coal use when overall demand is stagnant than when overall demand is growing. So, the US before 2005 had experienced electricity growth of about 2% a year. And had, electricity sales been growing at 2% a year in the US since 2005, overall electricity demand would be 24% higher in 2017 than it was in 2005. And, losing market share in a stagnant market has different implications than losing market share in a growing market. And that's something to keep in mind here. India has been kind of supercharged because in addition to rapid growth in electricity use, rapid annual growth, over the last decade, I guess, nearly 7%, coal's share in the electricity mix has actually been growing. So that's a combination of, working the other way in terms of an effect on absolute level of coal use. So I guess still on electricity, I don't want to spend too much time, but the developments in terms of solar PV module costs and wind turbine cost reductions has really been an incredible story. And it's having an effect. This is stuff, by the way, a lot of this material I took from Bloomberg New Energy Outlook. For wind turbines, shown on the left-hand side, this probably actually understates the reduction in the cost of wind, because the newer wind turbines can operate in a given location. They typically operate at a higher capacity factor than the older technologies. So if you take account both of the cost of the turbine and the fact that you get more generation, under a given wind condition, the cost of generation has actually fallen by more than 32%, on the wind side. And on the PV side, of course, this is the module only, and a lot varies in terms of the system costs, both across countries and between whether you're doing utility scale installation or small scale installation. But again, this is a big driver, and this one is going across the world. So I took the US, again, earlier on, you notice I said, we talk about fuel prices, talk about the US. So I took the US here alone. Very, you can do prices in the other countries, but it is more difficult because there are a whole variety of different coal prices in India. But generally, natural gas prices are higher in those places, and the coal prices sort of all over the place a little bit. Because coal depends on exactly where you are physically. The transportation cost is very high. India, there are all kinds of different arrangements between the state-owned coal producer. It has sort of different prices in the auction than it has in a contract market and all kinds of things. Also in China, I think you'll see different prices. So just in the US, I've just tried to illustrate coal and natural gas prices, what's happened. And, so these are dollars per million BTU, back to those good old EIA units. And the other thing I did is I calculated 0.7 times the gas price divided by the coal price, because you actually use less BTUs, in a typical gas plant in the United States to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity than you do BTUs of coal to generate a kilowatt hour. So the actual sort of fuel cost comparison is roughly approximated by this 0.7, times the natural gas price divided by the coal price. And you can see that, 2005, that was almost 400%. So it was clearly gas, even by 0.7, was much more expensive than running a coal plant, if you could run either one. But as you get down to 2009, the shale revolution starts to come into play. And all of a sudden you're talking in the, in the hundreds, 150 or less, sometimes under 100. And, that has definitely moved things a lot toward coal. There are other considerations beyond fuel costs that generally favor natural gas generation relative to coal-fired generation. You need less people operating the plant. You can ramp it up and down faster. All kinds of benefits. So you do not have to get that ratio does not have to go below 100% to make you prefer running coal to gas. And in fact, tremendous interest in that. So the prices have definitely moved things. So let me move on to energy security, which is like we talked before this thing began about Iran. We're not going to solve that one. And who knows what energy security is. But one thing people do look at is reliance on energy imports. And that varies really dramatically across fuels and countries. Right? So you look at oil, the famous thing that everyone talks about in terms of energy imports. And I tried to calculate both the consumption levels, and it's pretty easy to find that data, and the net imports divided by consumption, kind of net import reliance. Which again, it's not a great measure, but it's a measure that a lot of people look at. And again, given that we're just one factor here, I wanted to do that. And you can see that in the U.S., and we were going crazy back when I first joined EIA. It was like the U.S. was importing 60% of its oil, and our production was falling, our consumption was rising, and all kinds of policies, were being pursued. This is when some of the policies favoring, let's use more ethanol, let's have hydrogen-powered vehicles, maybe coming back again. Let's get serious about fuel economy standards. We're addicted to Middle Eastern oil. Let's, all these things were being done because we were importing 60%. 60% of our oil supplies came from overseas. Europe was really doing crazy stuff. They were like saying, let's switch to diesel because that'll save us. That'll reduce our oil consumption, and then it wasn't so good in terms of local air pollution. They have a big particulate problem now in some sense because of that transition. But people were willing to do a lot to deal with this. Well, again, if you compare the United States to China and India, well, the U.S. import dependence has come down. It was like on the order of 25% in 2017. It's much lower already. It's probably headed towards zero, probably headed toward being a net exporter. But if you compare to China and India, 75% of China's oil comes from abroad. 85% of India's oil comes from abroad. Again, you can do the same look at gas. The U.S. is already a net exporter. China and India, not quite in the same situation as they are with oil, but a lot of dependence on foreign supplies that will make them think maybe twice about shifting toward more dependence on gas. Again, on oil, when you get down to coal at the bottom, among the fossil fuels, that's where these countries, are most domestically dependent. And India is making great efforts, I think, to increase its thermal coal production and reduce thermal coal imports. They have significant thermal coal resources. They don't have metallurgical coal, so that they'll always be importing. But, I don't know what you can say about this. The other thing, of course, renewable energy, some of the things we looked at earlier, those are also great potentially from an energy security perspective, and they may also be great from a local pollution perspective, and also from a greenhouse gas perspective. So again, but just in looking among how the different countries might look at the relative role of the different fossil fuels, you can see, considerable differences. I guess one final note on energy security is that, one thing you might take away from this, especially with continuing boom in U.S. oil production, is that the U.S. doesn't have an energy security problem. But of course, that doesn't stop, claims being made from energy security problems. And in particular, the present administration is making the claim that we have to keep more fuel-secure sources of electricity generation, which then means coal and nuclear, operating. I think it's a pretty bogus argument, as could be seen by lots of things. It could be seen by the fact that if you look across the United States, where you have very different generation mixes, you don't find the ones that have high dependence on coal and nuclear being more reliable than the others. The other thing is, if you look at the cause of actual outages in the US, they all relate or predominantly relate to the transmission and distribution system, not to fuel security at the generation level. So again, people can make bad arguments about energy security, but it is a consideration in these things. And I think you see it, in the case of China, just one observation, they have continuing great interest in coal to liquids. And that's an example of a situation where concerns related to energy security are really in conflict with the reduction of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. So, the IEA, we'll see how many of these projects really come to fruition, but they've penciled in about a tripling of coal to liquids capacity between 2017 and 2023. And the fuels produced using CTL could be imported at lower cost with lower CO2 emissions, from foreign sources, suggesting, again, that in China, energy security concerns can sometimes, not always, China's doing a lot that's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but sometimes energy security concerns, hard to explain this, it isn't economically driven. It has to, certainly not driven by greenhouse gases, certainly not. So there you go. So local pollution, another concern. Combustion of fossil fuels, especially coal, I think, not just including coal, can be an important contributor to air quality concerns. Also emits carbon dioxide emissions. There are some real synergies, in tackling local pollutants and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as experienced in the United States. So again, what happened with the displacement of coal from electricity, good for greenhouse gases, good for local pollutants. So the synergies are real, but it's not necessarily the case that displacement of coal is a preferred strategy for addressing local and regional pollution issues that are typically of greatest concern to populations. So other strategies, including control systems that directly target emissions, actions affecting activities other than coal-fired generation, which also have a big role, may be preferred, particularly in societies that are also concerned with maintaining high levels of economic growth and dealing with some energy security type issues. Switching from coal to gas more might be problematic for them. Again, switching to renewables might be good for both. So there you go. So, I wanted to get sort of an overall handle on air quality concerns. And there are many different indicators, but the easiest one to get a grip on, and the one that I think most of the focus is on these days, is this very fine particulate matter. Particulates 2.5 microns or less. Keep in mind they're at 25,000 microns in an inch, so these are really small particles. And I guess the concern is that they're able to travel deeply into the respiratory tract. And there's been a lot of, this is not an air pollution seminar, but there's been a lot of concern that it's associated with all kinds of acute problems, and then also associated, with things like death, heart problems, all kinds of really serious medical problems. And the World Health Organization, has an average annual exposure standard to PM 2.5, says it should be, less than 10 micrograms per cubic meter. So that's the World Health Organization definition of clean air. The US EPA standard on an annual basis is maybe 12, but that's what we're talking about, way down at the bottom of that vertical scale on the left-hand side. And, this is a map that kind of just shows you, well, on an average, the average person in each of these countries. So again, there's tremendous variation within the country, of course. But, what does it look like? And you can see that in the US and Canada, Australia, Scandinavia, Iceland, there are a few countries where, on average, people are under that World Health Organization standard. Western Europe isn't one of them for some of the reasons that we discussed already, and some coal burning in Poland and Turkey without real strong controls. But the place where things are worse, is generally India, Mongolia, and China. That's where things are tough in terms of exposures. So let's take a look. So these three graphics start to look at the situation in China, and it kind of relates to this question of, can you really decouple, or should you decouple the local pollution problem from the greenhouse gas pollution? And the left-hand graph, kind of looks, is an index of what's happened since 2010, with the top line is GDP, so it's grown a lot relative to 2010. The next line is CO2 emissions, which have grown but have kind of leveled off. The next line is coal. I actually think it's a little peakier at the front than I think the coal data that I've seen is, but it's roughly right. And then you look at things like NOx, carbon monoxide, direct emissions of particulate matter, and emissions of sulfur dioxide. I should point out that NOx and sulfur dioxide are precursors of secondary particulate, PM2.5. So they interact in the atmosphere with other things and create more PM2.5. But if you look at this thing, you see that while GDP, CO2, and coal use were going up, NOx, carbon monoxide, particulate direct emissions, and SOx were really dropping pretty dramatically in China. China took a very, people were pretty annoyed about what was going on there, and the government, kind of took action. And if you look at the upper right-hand graph, this focuses on on what happened in coal-fired power generation, and you can see that around 2010, where that one begins, about the middle of the top graph, producing coal-fired power in China was producing about 10 grams of both NOx and SOx per kilowatt hour. And if you look at the red and the blue lines, and if you look at what's happened since then, they're down, between 1 and 2 grams per kilowatt hour now. This is the fleet average in China. And that underlies some of this kind of movement that we're seeing here. Power plants are really dominant in terms of SOx. They're less dominant in terms of NOx. So that's why on the left-hand graph, you don't see the same kind of, looks like on this power plant graph, they're kind of parallel percentage reductions. On the left-hand graph, they're not. And so, it's particularly impressive, although only for coal-fired power plants. So the lower right-hand graph actually compares sulfur dioxide emissions in 2005 and 2016. And this is done, using a variety of emissions data, both published data, which people have a lot of doubts about, but also data related to collected by satellite instruments. There's something called an ozone monitoring instrument on NASA's AURA satellite. And the picture, in fact, shown here is the average CO2 vertical column measurement over China for 2005 and 2016, expressed in Dobson units. So I'll let someone else explain, but I'll take their word for it. So in other words, this isn't just self-reported data. This is this is actually monitored kind of data. They tried to put different pieces together, and they also flew some airplanes. And I think what you see is something that's somewhat consistent with previous two figures we talked about. If you look at sulfur dioxide emissions in China, you see a very significant drop between 2005 and 2016. Doesn't mean that things are great, we know they're not great from the first picture we showed, but but you can make a significant progress. It's this one, not my computer. So here's India. So again, on the left-hand side, you're looking more at the PM2.5 emissions. These are the primary PM2.5s, the actual particles that come out of power plants, not the secondary stuff. This is from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a really interesting think tank in India that I think is quite good from what I've seen. And this is showing by vintage of plant what the PM2.5 emissions look like. And not surprisingly, they generally look better. You don't have the real high emitter plants, those dark colors that are for the older plants, the 50-year-old plants, the 40-year-old plants, the 30-year-old plants. And as you work your way, to the newer plants, you got more of the very low emitting plants. But the same study, which I thought was really interesting, using the same methods, also produced these column ozone measurements for SO2 in India in 2005 and 2016. And it's a little bit of a different story, right? On the previous page, there was a big improvement from 2005 to 2016. On this page, things are definitely getting worse. And people who know India know that the coal-producing region, where also a lot of power plants are located, is where that kind of the reddish blotch has grown, from 2005 to 2016. So there has been less progress, I think, in India on these types of strategies. And again, it's a question of what the priority is. I mean, India does have these plans to do something. I know they've been delayed. There were some things that were supposed to take effect in 2018. They're not. I don't know when it will be. I hear 2021 maybe. For industry, they've done very little. So again, it's the relative weight placed on different issues. Oops, wrong way again. Let me write this forward. So the other thing to keep in mind, is that things vary. As I said, that first graphic was just a picture of everything. Here, if you look at the actual exposures on the left-hand side, you can see that these are by the different places within India. So you can see that in Uttar Pradesh and in West Bengal, you got these folks, with these very dark colors, greater than 90 micrograms per cubic meter exposure on an annual average basis. Really bad. Delhi, really bad. Some other places, better. And then when you look at the causes of it, which is this picture on the right-hand side is only for Delhi, you can see that it's a mix of things. So again, the WHO guidance, the bar there in Delhi extends up real high, like above 120 exposure, relative to a standard of 10 from the World Health Organization. But the amount of that actually comes from power plants, so there are really two places where that would come from. One is the actual black bar in the middle there, which is not a huge part of the whole column. And the other is that green bar, which is called secondary PM2.5. And that is caused, in part, well, it's three things that really contribute there. It's sulfur dioxide, which does come from power plants. It is nitrous oxide, which comes from power plants, but also comes from other things like transport. And it's ammonia, which comes from waste and other type of things. So there is secondary formation, I don't know, maybe a third of it could be related to power plants, rough accounting. So you'd add more to the black bar, but you would come nowhere near like the whole problem or even the most important part of the problem in Delhi is tied to those emissions. So, again, things to keep in mind. Finally, we can talk about the government role in coal production and transport. Again, I'd refer you to the Brookings study, but Coal India Limited, government-owned corporation, produces 84% of India's direct coal. Uh, they're very heavily involved. There's a lot of government revenue. There's a lot of revenue that goes to certain states. There's a lot of, a lot of employment. There's a lot going on. China also has really a significant role in coal prices and coal markets, a lot of role of state-owned enterprises, a lot of direct regulation of the production process within the markets. In the US, the government really doesn't play a big role except in leasing in the West, which accounts for about 40% of our coal production. So in the US, governments are much less involved, although they do have a role in permitting transportation infrastructure. But there are important differences there. And the government role in electricity markets also varies. So, I think governments at all levels in China and India play a very big role. The federal role in the US is pretty small, but the state role in the US is pretty big. And the states have really taken the lead in mandating a lot of renewables and trying to rescue nuclear in doing those types of things. Oh, goodness, I've gone too long. And I haven't even gotten to the forecast. Well, I'll stop then. I'll go right to the forecast and then I'll shut up and I'll listen to Nick. It's good that I looked at the clock. The coal projections. I don't get too deep in this, but those of you familiar with the IEA knows that they have sort of a new policies scenario, which is sort of what people have taken on, even though they haven't necessarily enacted it. So it would include like their Paris commitments. There's a current policy scenario, which is kind of law, what's enacted, and there's supposedly based on what's enacted, and there's a sustainable development scenario, which is kind of what would it take to achieve our goals. Paris goals is one of the goals they look at. Energy availability, modern energy availability is a goal they look at. Reduction of local pollution is a goal they look at. Comes out of the Sustainable Development Program and the energy-related goals in there. So those are their three scenarios. I mean, the third one is really a working backwards scenario. If we want to do this, this is how we might do it. And so, we're all for coal use. The NPS is going to have lower coal use than the CPS because it includes some of these commitments in Paris and other things that have been made. But really, IEA sees a very flattish kind of, flat to a slow decline in this, or a slow rise in the CPS scenario and flattish in the NPS scenario. Just focus on the compound annual rate of growth in the last column. For China and the US, it's a drop. In the NPS scenario, increase for India. In the CPS scenario, China goes positive. The United States stays negative, which I think is widely, expected the United States to be negative. Again, the United States is only in the electricity sector, and coal is really getting the Jesus beaten out of it. Only in the SDS do you have these big drops across, all three countries. So that's like the IEA world. Again, this is just a picture of total what happens to electricity generation and generation using coal. One thing to keep in mind is that coal use doesn't necessarily follow generation using coal, because where coal plants are being added, they're generally more efficient. So that gives you a little coal-fired generation can rise more rapidly than coal use itself. But no big story there. The EIA stuff is very similar. One difference I think you would see is that probably out to 2040, the EIA stuff sees somewhat faster reductions in the United States. I've shown two scenarios because I was always fighting with the people that worked for me when I was at EIA, and I always felt that they had, too high a price outlook for natural gas built into their reference case. So I kind of forced them to run something called the high oil and gas resource case. And to me, that's like the real, more like the real one. But you can see that, the compound, annual rate of growth in coal use really drops very dramatically with that high oil and gas resource base in the U.S. And again, we have positive India and a world that looks eerily similar to the EIA projections. This one here is Bloomberg. I thought it would be interesting to look outside of the official agencies, and I think they see I say a big this is particularly in power, and they see even quicker shift away from coal-fired power generation than the IEA or the EIA outlooks. They're really not clear about their policy assumptions, which is one thing I think I would always say about Bloomberg. Not clear how its scenarios might be influenced by concerns related to economic factors, energy security, which does seem to play a role in some of these decisions, or local pollution questions. So the graphic on the left side shows that the role of fossil fuels in the generation mix, which is above 60% today, declines to less than 30% by 2050, and the coal share falls from about 40% today to about 14% by 2050. And it's a challenge, I think. They're getting 48% of generation at the end by solar and wind. I think that is talking about something I work on, which is storage. You're gonna really need some significant advances in cost reduction in storage to make something like this work. Again, entirely possible, could happen. I would also say that, China certainly now is pursuing a very large effort to increase its storage capacity. So that could be used for a variety of things, but they certainly are bulking up their storage. So that, I think, bodes well for that possibility. And this is their view of absolute coal use for power generation. And they see a 57% reduction in the level of coal use for generation between 2017 and 2050. And the absolute decline is 62% in China, 39% in India. This is definitely a lot more than in the IEA new and current policy scenarios, or the EIA scenario that uses current policy assumptions. And the Americas and Europe really have, major reductions in coal use, which kind of makes sense. I guess I want to stop after the next one, just for time, because I think we're better off talking then. So last but not least is the view from McKinsey. They put out an outlook too, which focuses on different fuels. So starting with the left-hand graph, they see relatively, this is really total energy use, coal's at the bottom. They see relatively slow growth in total world energy use, growing only about, I think, 14% from 2016 to 2050. Like Bloomberg, they envision a significant decline in coal use to 2050, but not as large. It's about a 40% decline in coal use, if you do the math. And finally, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that, again, unlike Bloomberg, sort of, I think McKinsey's sort of between Bloomberg and the EIA, IEA kind of set of projections. So unlike Bloomberg, they see increases in coal use in India. In 2050, India would be using more coal than it is today. It would be up, I can't read the damn thing, but it would be up, I think it says 60% in that little green circle under India. And they also see it in some other areas, but they see a very big drop in China, which is the second from the end there. You see a 65% drop in China, with a mix between the power sector and other sectors. And so it's a somewhat interesting and different view. But clearly a lot of the reduction is, again, depending on China. So with that, I was going to say a little bit more about the US and a little bit more about steelmaking, but it's probably better to stop, get some real wisdom from our colleague. and then, have a discussion, which is what the meeting's about.
Thank you, thank you. Nico Stavros is an adjunct here at SAIS, but also a senior fellow at CSIS. He was for a number of years head of the gas practice at PFC Energy and advised companies and governments around the world. Since then, he's been a commercial advisor to the Alaska State Legislature, assisting them in planning an LNG project. And Nikos has published a number of articles both on gas and energy economics in general. And he has an MA from SAIS.
What higher praise?
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Howard, for this great presentation. I have very few slides, so I just wanted to mostly add to what Howard said by zooming in particularly on Southeast Asia. Before I do that, I wanted to start with a global picture. And this is a terrible table because it's very unfair to pick just like 2 years because you're missing a lot of what happens before and after. But I think it's quite telling. It's a picture from the International Energy Agency. On the left is how, as a world, we generate our energy. And on the right is how we generate our electricity. And I think what's striking about this picture is that for all the talk about energy transition, the cost of renewables, blah, 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 over the last 18 years, the share of coal in primary energy has gone up. And this increase has mostly come at the expense of oil and nuclear. And then there's been a little bit of an increase in gas and hydro and in other renewables. And if you look at the power sector, essentially what the world has done since 2000, between 2000 and 2018, it's kind of replaced oil with gas. So oil is minus 5%, gas is plus 5 percentage points. And then it's lost a little bit of hydro and a little bit of coal, and that's what renewables have provided. So in a way, everything we've done so far hasn't really decarbonized anything. And so Howard talked about the US, the India, and the coal and the China part of that story. So I wanted to focus on the Southeast Asia part of that story. Part of the reason is, as Howard articulated really well, is coal is essentially becoming an Asia story. That since kind of like the mid 80s, you can see the rest of the world has gone through a couple of phases of a huge decline in coal consumption. And that increasingly everything is driven by the Asia Pacific. That now about 75% of the coal that is consumed in the world is in the Asia Pacific region. So effectively, if you want to do something about coal, yes, like you can beat on the Germans and all that for political reasons. But at the end of the day, if you don't get a handle on Asia, you're not really going to get very far. And what I wanted to talk about is that a lot of times when we talk about Asia, we tend to focus either on the China part. So on the left is kind of like China, non-China. On the right is India, so everything outside of China. So it's India, which Howard talked about. OECD Asia Pacific, by the way, is still growing. That's essentially Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Not driven by New Zealand, in case you're wondering. But then there's the other Asia Pacific part, which is what I want to focus more of my slides on, which seems to be kind of like booming at a China or India type trajectory, right? And in absolute numbers, obviously the consumption is still quite low. It's at about 200 million tons of oil equivalent versus about almost 2,000 in China, right? So scale-wise, it's not anywhere near either the China or the India consumption. But it's definitely something that you would start to worry about when you think about the overall consumption of coal. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of zoom in on that Asia Pacific region and just kind of have a couple of slides to talk about what's happening there and how I'm thinking about this. One is on the left-hand side is the consumption by fuel for a select number of Southeast Asian countries. And on the right is the fuel mix. So essentially the left divided by the total. Okay. So what's interesting to me is if you look on the right, effectively what happened in the 70s and 80s, you were essentially gas was displacing oil. Obviously, oil was still growing, but gas was growing faster. And then kind of like nothing happened in the 80s and 90s. The fuel mix kind of stayed more or less flat. And then as you went towards the late 90s, early 2000s, you have another wave of switching. In this case, mostly at the expense of oil. The first wave is gas and coal together. But then one of the things that I find quite worrisome, and anyone who cares about sort of the climate aspects will find worrisome, you sort of see gas sort of hit a peak around the mid-2000s in terms of the share of primary energy and actually start to decline. So effectively, in these terms, again, everything is growing because the denominator is growing, the primary energy is growing, so everything is growing. But in terms of fuel shares, essentially the region is switching from gas to coal. Essentially, that is what that is showing, which is not great from a carbon perspective. It's not great from a particular matter perspective. Howard talked about sort of the air quality issues. I was looking at this data very recently, and the World Health Organization says that 4.2 million people died in 2016 because of ambient air pollution, and sort of 2/3 of those were in Asia, right? If you look at the worst cities, as Howard talked about, in terms of particular matter, 2.5 pollution, and 85% of them are in Asia, right? And it's not just India and China, it's other countries as well. And the thing that I find interesting is this is the share of energy that comes from gas versus coal. And the reason I like this chart is this looks very orderly, right? It's almost like people kind of got together and said, let's do coal. And the reality is that that's not really what happened. What you see, though, is if you look at the green part, which is the gas, what I see it kind of like as a gas person is whatever the long-term trajectory is, and whether you stabilize at 20% or 60%, the last 5-10 years it's down. Sometimes the last 20 years it's down, right? So Bangladesh, down. Indonesia, down. Malaysia, down. Pakistan, down. Philippines, down. Sri Lanka doesn't use gas. Thailand, down. Vietnam, down. Right? So in every part of this region, the share of energy that comes from natural gas is going down. Right? And sometimes the replacement is coal. Sometimes it's not. But a lot of times the replacement is coal. And I think some of the challenges that we face in dealing with this with this question is, many countries in this region essentially have historically been either net exporters of gas or self-sufficient in gas. And so they haven't really been able to manage the transition to imports in a way that preserves the share of gas, right? That gas is more expensive, and therefore they can't really consume gas at the same level as before. One data point that I love to talk about is if you look, say, at LNG consumption over the last 6 years, half the growth in demand in LNG came from China. Half the growth. Now, if you read the annual report of PetroChina, they tell you that they lose money on every source of imports of gas to the country. They lose money on pipeline gas from Central Asia, they lose money on pipeline gas from Myanmar, and they lose money on LNG. So if you're trying to make gas part of the solution, if you're selling a product that's losing money, there's only so much you can do, right? So unless there is a policy driver, as Howard described in China, where you kind of have an overriding maybe air pollution concern, it's really hard for gas to compete. The other thing that's been happening is because of the advice that everyone is giving these countries, there's a lot of price reform taking place. So the Malaysians have been told for years, and Petronas will tell the Malaysian government, the price of gas is very cheap, you have to increase the price, increase the price, increase the price. Well, when you do that, gas 10 years ago was cheaper than coal, 25% cheaper than coal. Now it's 20% more expensive than coal, right? So yes, you get price reform and you're more aligned with what the IEA and the World Bank tell you the pricing structure should be, but then coal becomes a lot more competitive, and so you have a challenge with that. And the other part, of course, is for a lot of these countries, one of the things that's striking when you compare U.S. coal, the graph that Howard showed in terms of coal versus gas pricing, in the U.S. the price of coal is relatively stable. It kind of goes up and down a little bit. For a lot of these countries, it doesn't. It's like the Wild West. It's really very high, very low, exposed to international markets. So it's not necessarily that you're buying this really nice, cheap commodity over a long term. That's not the experience at all. But it is a lot of times more attractive than gas. So just to finish up here, to a large extent, when we talk about coal, we really have to be talking about Asia. Even though, yes, there are still pockets of coal consumption, the US and Europe, even in the former Soviet Union, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, these are places that still consume coal. But really, if you want to get a handle on this at the global level, it's about Asia. And I don't think it's fair to continue to talk about this problem or this challenge fundamentally in purely China and India terms, because it's a much broader consumption base. A lot of it is driven by cost, but as Howard alluded to, it's not just cost. In a lot of these countries, there's a desire to sort of utilize local resources. So this idea that we have it, we should use it. In Indonesia, that's very pervasive. In Pakistan, which is now boosting its coal use, there's sort of the sense that if you don't use the coal, it's going to be wasted. And so that's creating an impetus. And also for some of these countries, there is an energy security and diversification concern. Like if your energy is coming 60% from gas and you're no longer self-sufficient in gas, using coal, even if it's imported coal, could provide a measure of energy security because it's diversifying your fuel mix. It's the same case with Thailand that kind of like built up the coal industry, even though it was still using gas. And so in a way, you have to find a solution to provide energy to these countries that still are on the really rapid growth path if you want to address this. The last thing I'll say, which is sort of the positive side of, there's kind of like 20 seconds of positivity at the end of 10 minutes of grim. The one thing I'll say is that what we've learned from the United States, but we've also learned in Europe, particularly the UK, is that when an alternative source becomes competitive, the decline in coal can be quite dramatic unless politicians step in to stop it, right? Or if politicians are willing to accelerate it, right? So you look at the US, the decline in coal use was about 40% over a decade. If you look at the IEA sort of Paris numbers, coal use in the world, and Howard showed these numbers, has to basically fall by about 60% between now and 2040, right? So it's not, if you find a way to deliver energy to these countries at a lower cost, I don't think it's fair to just assume that because the power plant got built, it's baked in forever and has to produce for 40, 50, 60 years. That's not really our experience. It's only that if you can't find an alternative, or if the political economy is such that it prevents that alternative from really undercutting coal. So I think it's a challenge that we have is both an economic challenge in terms of finding cheaper source of energy, but also a political economy challenge to find a way to essentially strand these assets and provide sort of a support network around, if you're going to strand these assets, that creates a lot of economic and job security and trouble that you have to manage. So I think that's how I read the challenge. But as you can see, it's pretty widespread. It's not just about sort of China and India. So with that also.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank our speakers here. Floor is open for questions or comments. Yes. Can you tell us more about the coal and steel making?
Oh, well, so steel making, a couple of things. I mean, it's metallurgical coal. It's actually more valuable than thermal coal. Clearly, China was producing about half of the steel. and using tremendous amounts of met coal. India is expected to produce a lot more steel. India is moving up. I think it's likely to become the #2 steel maker very in the next year or 2 or 3. Currently, China, half the world, followed by Japan, then by India, then by the United States. So again, China, India, United States are 3 out of the top 4. But in the United States, something like 68% of the steel, I think, is currently electric arc furnace steel, which doesn't really use met coal. And in China, 90% of the steel is basic oxygen furnace steel, which does use met coal. India is sort of in between there, more electric steel share than China, but less than the United States. As I already said, although they have a lot of thermal coal, they don't have any met coal, so they're maybe less attracted to going down that path. The other thing that affects it is the amount, even in the basic oxygen furnace, you can use different amounts of scrap, as part of the charge. And the more scrap you use, the less met coal you need. And, China increased its steel production very rapidly between like 2000 and 2015. It was really, truly amazing. And honestly, they didn't have when you drive in the American countryside, you see all these junk cars and all these things that are piled up for, stuff that will be the source of scrap. And I think China really needed to increase steel production from a situation where they didn't have a lot of scrap. So, you're going to find, I think, more scrap being used even in the basic oxygen furnace technology in the world. So those are some of the kind of factors. The other thing is how fast world steel will actually grow. The OECD Steel Committee sees significant slowdown in steel growth. I think they have to 2035, their outlook is something like 1.1% compound annual growth in steel. So again, it'll be important in places where steel is going to grow, like India. I think in China, steel production is actually has plateaued and is kind of level. Good. Good question.
Yes.
Good afternoon. Could you discuss if there was like a coal miner in the room and they were wondering about their job security over the next 20 years in the United States, what would you say to them about an outlook?
So the number of coal miners has fallen. We have to realize is that they're, will describe my career. When I first went to work for Carter, there was this big battle about the Clean Air Act of 1977. I was a young guy like you. I was, and people were really having it out over this. And there might have, there was a lot more coal employment in the country then. A lot of the loss in coal mining jobs, in some sense, has already occurred. Again, that doesn't make things, very happy for coal mining workers. The other thing is, I think you'll find that the coal mining labor force has gotten older, and people do not, although they're good, very high-paying jobs, they do not necessarily encourage. One does not necessarily encourage one's children to want to take on those jobs. So there will be some natural retirement. I think a bigger challenge than the employment itself may be the coal mining communities. If you own a house in a community where the whole purpose of the community, its location is determined by the location of a coal seam, and that coal seam stops being worked, you really do have a problem. The whole community can collapse, and the value of the community can collapse, and it can make it very hard to have mobility. So it is a really challenging issue. In some places like West Virginia, where there's been a very big boom in natural gas as part of the Marcellus, Utica play, there's been talk about moving people from coal mining to natural gas industry, but in some in some ways, it's just remote, and that can be difficult. It doesn't always work out. But you're talking on the order of 80,000 people. That's what the current kind of level of coal mining employment is, I believe, roughly. And, we're talking about an economy that has an employment total of something like 130 million or maybe even more. So it's a serious problem, and you're right to think about it. There aren't that, economists often say things like, gee, we could pay every coal miner, $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year and send them to the Bahamas, and that sounds like a smart aleck economist kind of answer, not like a real, so it's a challenging situation.
A contributing factor to that, I guess, is coal mining has gotten more advanced technology over the years. So production efficiency has increased, which means fewer workers. And that's a secondary factor. Yes, Doug.
I'm an adjunct here at SICE as well. I was struck by the coal to liquids numbers there in China. How economic is that, or is that being done by government, through government leadership and damn the cost?
I think there is a significant, I think some kind of energy security concern is motivating that. China's also really going huge on something that the United States once did in terms of building strategic reserves. So you can look at coal to liquids, building strategic reserves, really, I think the push for electric vehicles is like a triple win in China, in terms of gas production is really important. But I think when these things come into conflict with each other, gas emissions, then they would need.
Do you have any idea what the cost of production is on like a barrel basis?
I don't know at those specific plants, but I know it's really, the only other place that had significant coal to liquids, was South Africa, which had an embargo problem, and that was truly a national security thing. And even the gas to liquids, which is a easier technology, which was pursued in places like the Middle East, especially like places that had gutter that had condensate, and they produced gas as a byproduct, and the gas was virtually free. And even the economics of those plants is not great. So I don't think the economics is very good. I think you got to look at that one as a for better or worse. I don't know that it really provides a lot of energy security, but I look at that as an energy security kind of motivation.
Nikos, let me ask you a question. If you could maybe just repeat, of those countries you were talking about in Asia that seem to be ramping up coal use, which are the most significant? I guess Vietnam is one. Right?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on whether you look at it on an absolute basis or a growth basis, and also what period of time. So if you look at the last 10 years, the growth in coal use, the countries are in this order: China, India, South Korea, Vietnam. Right. If you look at it in terms of overall energy use, Indonesia is the biggest consumer. I'm trying to think of the countries in between. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it was actually quite interesting, just the extent to which Vietnam over the last 10 years, that delta is actually quite significant.
Hi, following this question, I'm interested with Malaysia and Indonesia. I know that they produce or export a lot of LNG or natural gas, and I'm just curious, is Petronas the only major supplier for Malaysia? Is that why they have a lot of say with the government telling them sort of how to price? And how can that change?
I mean, I think they would take issue with the idea that they have as much say as you suggest. They've been trying to get higher prices in Malaysia for a very long time, and the Malaysian government didn't really want to do that. So, I mean, I think that the challenge for both Indonesia and Malaysia, so both of them are still net exporters of gas. In both of them, the amount of gas that they're exporting as a share has been declining. Both of them are now have import facilities. Indonesia still mostly does Indonesia to Indonesia LNG trade, not imports. Malaysia actually does have imports. So I think of it more as a question of recognizing that a lot of these gas industries were built on very cheap domestic gas. And the fact that once you no longer have this cheap domestic gas, you kind of need to change your pricing system. Some of these countries have been doing it in a much more orderly, long-term way. So Thailand has kind of like the more poster child how price reform should work, where they're putting sort of different streams of gas together, and they have different pricing for different sectors that are more against competing fuels. The Malaysians have actually been a lot kind of like slower in terms of increasing prices, so like flat for a very long time, and then it kind of shoots up. So there's a little bit of an adjustment challenge. Indonesia is kind of like all over the place, depending on which sector you're looking at. But if you look at like the Indonesians, the LNG that they're trading within the country, the pricing for that LNG is actually quite good. Part of it is also the fact that gas is doing well in some of these places, not necessarily in the power sector, but in industry. You still have sort of industry where you're competing directly with oil. You're much better off sort of having an inroad there. So there is a kind of like a pricing, even like, you know, if you look at India, there's kind of like about 6 different gas markets, and gas is doing really poorly in some, like power, but it's doing much better in others. So there is a little bit of that segmentation that you see in different parts.
So in India, you have a lot of gas-powered vehicles in some of the urban, Delhi and some of those areas dealing with some of the problems. And you also have industry, right? It's a pretty attractive gas market.
Yep.
Yes.
Tell us who you are.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And today's a very interesting discussion of corporate culture. And I'm very pleased to attend this discussion. So I'm from a Japanese national corporation with oil and gas and good corporate. And I have a sort of one question. So that it is a sort of influence of the introducing a CCS and CCUS will make a positive impact or negative impact for the sort of share of electricity by coal. So because in the United States, so the expecting for the CCS and the CCS now it is increasing. And so sometimes the United States administration is encouraged to introduce the CCS. But however, if the so that CCS and CCUS will be introducing, it has needed much more cost for the coal plant. But for the clean oil, for the adaptive to climate change issue. So answer I ask the question. So negative impact or positive.
I'm talking about CCUS first.
A little bit. So all I would say is I think CCUS probably in the U.S. would be on a coal plant would be very difficult.
Let's define what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
sorry, carbon capture. CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. CCUS is carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So if you would pump the carbon into, say, an oil and gas field and use it to increase oil and gas production, that would be CCUS. The idea is that you can use the carbon, not just store it. But in the U.S., you have very cheap natural gas. You have very old existing coal plants, and
there is a question as to whether one would ever add something as expensive as CCUS to a coal plant that is already very, very old. It's like if you're deciding to put a new transmission into your car. If your car is 2 years old and it needs it, you might do it. But if your car is 20 years old and it needs a new transmission, you'll probably go get a new car. And so I think, and in the case of the US, it probably won't be a coal-fired car. So in the US, it's hard. I think for coal plants, I think it is possible in the US to see there's some really interesting cycles, like the alum cycle. In Texas, there's a plant that runs on a power plant, 50 megawatt, so not tiny, demonstration plant. It's almost commercial scale. The next one would be 350 megawatts, which is really commercial scale, that runs on supercritical CO2 as the working fluid. And potentially there, you get you use natural gas, you burn it with oxygen, you get a pure stream of CO2. And that kind of cycle might happen in the US, but a lot depends on the carbon pricing. That's going to be pretty important. And it's also going to have to compete with renewables coupled with storage. So there's a lot of moving parts. But I think it's hard to envision for coal plants in the US. It might be easier, my analogy of the car, in Asia, you probably have a lot of would be 2-year-old cars. And there, again, with the price put on carbon, one might see a sort of a CCUS solution with coal. But again, that raises the bigger question of how important greenhouse gas reduction is versus other things. And so it's a very good question, and there's no easy answer, except I think in the United States, you probably won't see it on coal plants. You will see it other places. You will see it on ethanol plants. You'll see it on hydrogen plants, potentially. So there's a lot of interesting issues surrounding CCUS.
If I can add one thing only, I agree with everything that Howard said.
That goes without saying.
I think the question for me is, you basically have the cost of general electricity from a coal plant. Do you want to build a CCS or CCUS either to it or when you build a new one? That raises the cost. And if you're going to do that, how do you pay for that? Is the carbon tax, or if you raise the cost of electricity, why would you do that rather than just doing gas or renewables? The way I've always thought of CCS in this context is it does allow you to get out of some of the political economy challenges, right? So you could, in theory, say, hey, if I do CCS, the price of electricity goes up, I might as well do solar, wind, batteries, and gas. But if I do that, I'm going to destroy my coal industry and strand a lot of capital and put a lot of people out of work. And I don't want to do that. So therefore, CCS kind of like allows you to meet some of your climate and air pollution targets without some of those sort of second order externalities. I mean, we've seen in Germany just kind of how difficult it is to close down the coal industry, right? And sort of the example that you gave, I was like, oh, you can just pay people off, even with paying people off.
I was joking.
I know, but like even with that mindset, it's still very challenging and very hard to do, right?
They don't take lessons from the nuclear industry. They seem to manage to close that down.
But so I've always thought of CCS as providing kind of like that, and at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what's the cost and all that. But it is one of those areas that it provides a significant chunk of the reduction in CO2 emissions. Say like the IEA outlook, that a share of the coal and the gas used is subject to CCS out to 2040. And so the way I always think of it is, if you don't have it, then all the numbers that the IEA puts out have to be that much lower to offset the fact that you don't have CCS.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yes, Nancy Cassini. Thank you very much for your presentation. So it's really interesting to see that there is a global demand for coal still, and that's increasing. But in many of the countries that you also talked about, there's also an increasing push to transition fully to renewable energies and renewable energy technologies. So I would be interested to know what the countries that you talked about, especially the smaller countries that are not China and India, like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, what they could do to make, and how realistic is it for them to transition from coal to renewable energy, and how soon?
One is, it does seem to me that if you take a more holistic picture of coal, if you add, 4.2 million people dying every year from ambient air pollution into your levelized cost of electricity number, if you take a broader view of coal, I think you realize that maybe you're not getting as much of a bargain as you thought. And so I think that's one part of having a better conversation in terms of, just because you see on a piece of paper that the cost of electricity is lower, it doesn't mean you have to go for that option, because you're going to pay for that low cost at some point later on. I think that's one. The second one is, I think you still need to both bring down the cost, but also bring the capital required for renewable energy sources. There's a part of that story that's not just about cost, but is about how you integrate renewables in the grid, and how do you run electricity markets that actually can incentivize and incorporate renewables. I mean, even in the United States and in Europe, which have been at this for much longer, we're kind of still at that level of like scratching our heads around like, how do you really, because we have an electricity system that's not particularly well suited to zero marginal cost electricity. So there are some broad questions about electricity design, and so I think for a lot of these countries, it's not just about copying what the West did, but trying to figure out how to avoid the mistakes of the West and incentivize renewables. In terms of how quickly things can happen, I'm a believer in, the energy system doesn't change until it does. And when it changes dramatically, right? So, I live in a world where people talk about energy as being this big, slow system, while at the same time, they'll talk about the shale gas revolution that changed everything within 10 years, and it killed coal within 10 years. So that 10, 15-year period is the period that we can actually do a lot of stuff. But you can only do a lot of stuff if you're kind of like working at it, or if the economics are very compelling. It's not just, the inertial state is not pointing you towards a lower carbon future, which is, as I showed in the beginning, and also as Howard showed in terms of the new policies or even neither of them are pushing you towards a lower carbon future.
of the countries that you talked about, it sounds like India is really the larger problem going forward. If you take it that China has made pledges and is beginning to reduce coal consumption gradually, but India is not. How does one solve that problem?
It's like a budget problem in the federal government for a small agency. It's like, budgets are going to be cut. Well, in general, budgets can be cut, but I can swing the other direction. So, I'm not sure that the world solution in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, has to see a cut in every, source of carbon dioxide emissions in every single country. I don't think that's, it's really likely to happen. I guess the way you really solve it is when the economics get if the economics were to get extremely compelling for renewables and storage, I think that could really make a big difference. It's just like the world went from, telecommunications used to have these big copper cables, and then, fiber optics got invented, right? You don't need a framework convention on fiber optics to get people to put that stuff in, right? You had people ripping up the streets and putting it in as fast as they could and abandoning it's like Nico says, and abandoning the old technology because it was just, and so it didn't live its normal lifetime, as we say. I think Nicholas and I have similar views. So I think part of the answer might be, one of the things that would change it in India would be a super compelling economic case. But one thing to keep in mind, and I didn't talk about it at length, although I talked at length, is that, you do have these, even if you got that, you have these, the whole railway tariffs for everything else, including passengers, is subsidized by coal transport. The whole, some of these individual states that are coal mining states in India, and even the federal government rely heavily on the sector for revenue. The CIL itself produces, Coal India Limited, produces 85% of the coal. It's a part of the government. So you really have some challenges, even if, the economics were compelling. You're probably going to have some people, fighting to maintain this dirty fuel that's killing 4.2 million people a year. So it's really challenging. But I think the world can progress. I think the question is, can the world progress? I think is more the answer than trying to get every country, regardless of its circumstances. I kind of sound like I go back in the Framework Convention negotiations a really long way. And I remember there was, what was this, common but differentiated, responsibility and who has to do what. And I think the developing world has come a long way in terms of, I think, understanding that it ain't just going to be the OECD countries, and that whole split in the Kyoto Protocol between Annex 1 and the rest and the whole. But that said, I don't think you can really try to line up everybody to take an equal Procrustean bed, right? Procrustes was the guy who they kind of, your legs were too long and they stuck over the end of the bed. The adjustment was made by cutting off your legs, not lengthening the bed. I think you're going to have to make some accommodations. You don't have to go back to the bad old days of the Kyoto Protocol where the developing countries did nothing. But the notion that they're gonna, cut their absolute level of coal use every country, I don't know. Do you want to hold out for that? You may have to hold your breath a long time.
Okay. Let's maybe close on that point. And we do have a little reception if you can stay on for a few more minutes for a glass of wine. But thanks again to our speakers for doing a great job here.